Hey guys, ever wonder what it feels like to have a throat that sounds like a rusty hinge, while a dozen angry townsfolk waggle torches at you? Before we riff on the medieval gig economy, smash that like button like you're trying to knock a lute's string loose, and drop a comment about the worst job you've ever had. Now dim the lights, cue the crackling fire, and imagine yourself squeezed between a filthy tavern cellar and the smell of spilled ale and goat cheese. You wake up at dawn, voice hoarse from last night's raucous ballad about a dragon that never existed, and the mayor shouts, "Sing louder or pay up," while rats scurry like unpaid apprentices. The crowd's breath is a mash of stale beer, sweat, and a faint hint of desperation. And every clump of applause feels like a wooden spoon striking a pot of boiled cabbage. Think of it as modern-day influencer burnout. But instead of Instagram trolls, you've got actual trolls under the bridge demanding royalties. So tell me, would you trade your Wi-Fi for a battered lute? Or is the thought of daily earplugs enough to make you run for the nearest exit? In the early light of a bustling market town, the cobblestones still damp from the night's dew, a young minstrel named Aldrich cradled a well-worn lute against his chest. He watched the merchants arrange barrels of barley and the bakers polish loaves, each scent of fresh bread and roasting meat painting a promise of applause. Aldrich imagined his name echoing off timbered walls, children pausing their games to listen, lords offering gold for a clever verse. The thin sunlight filtered through the awnings, turning his tattered cloak a warm amber, and he felt the first stir of ambition flutter like a sparrow's wing. Yet the crowd remained a sea of indifferent faces, their conversations a low hum that swallowed his quiet hope. When Aldrich finally lifted his lute and struck a tentative chord, the market's clamor rose to a sharper pitch, as if the very stones were listening. A group of hungry laborers paused, their cheeks hollow, and demanded a song of food, their eyes flickering with restless impatience. A lord in a fur-trimmed coat stepped forward, his hand restless, insisting Aldrich recount a tale of distant battles, his smile thin as cracked leather. Aldrich's fingers slipped on the strings, the melody wobbling like a candle flame in a draught, while a distant cough carried the whispered threat of plague through the lanes. The coin he earned clinked lightly in his pocket, not enough to buy a fresh loaf, and the market's bustle seemed to close in, a weight pressing upon his chest. Later, as the sun dipped and shadows lengthened, Aldrich found himself sharing a crust of stale bread with a street-molded dog, the crust hard enough to scrape his teeth. The lord who had demanded a war ballad laughed, his voice rolling like distant thunder, and offered Aldrich a single silver token that barely covered the cost of that bread. Aldrich realized that fame in the market was as fleeting as a summer breeze. That applause dissolved into the next merchant's chant for better prices. irony settled like dust on his lute, each note now sounding less like triumph and more like a gentle reminder of his modest place. He lingered beneath a lantern's soft glow, feeling both humbled and oddly grateful for the small kindnesses that survived the day's harsh ledger. Night settled over the town, a cool veil brushing the stone arches, and Aldrich slipped into a dim tavern where the hearth's glow painted the walls with amber strokes. He settled onto a worn wooden stool, the surface warm from countless evenings, and let the low murmur of patrons and the crackle of fire soothe his tired muscles. The rain pattered against the shutters, a steady rhythm that matched his heartbeat, while a distant cough echoed faintly, a reminder of the unseen danger outside. Aldrich placed his lute beside him, fingers resting lightly on the strings, feeling the subtle vibration of the room's quiet chorus. In that stillness, the market's chaos became a distant echo, and his breath steadied with the comforting cadence of ordinary life. In the quiet hours before dawn, Aldrich reflected on the narrow thread that had woven his days, a melody stitched between hungry mouths, fickle patronage, and the ever-present whisper of illness. He recognized that his survival lay not in grand fame, but in the simple act of pressing strings, of offering a moment of respite to those passing through the market's lanes. The faint glow of sunrise filtered through the tavern's window, casting a soft light on his worn hands, now calm and steady. Aldrich understood that the balance he had sought was less a triumph over hardship and more an acceptance of the modest rhythm of life. With a gentle smile, he lifted his lute once more, letting the first note drift out with the morning mist, a quiet testament to endurance and quiet humility. Aldrich, a lute-strummed bard of modest fame, walked the cobbled market square of Rivenford as the late morning sun painted the stone in amber. He carried a worn leather satchel that smelled faintly of pine resin and parchment, and his voice lingered on the edge of every tavern doorway. When the marble banner of Count Roderick fluttered above the town hall, the Count's messengers offered Aldrich a gilded contract for nightly performances. The contract promised a steady purse of silver coins and a small chamber near the great hall, a rarity for a wandering minstrel. Yet the Count's eyes, hidden behind a heavy hood, hinted at a desire for more than melody, a craving for praise that would stitch his name into every courtyard rumor. Aldrich accepted, feeling the weight of the quill-etched agreement settle like a warm stone in his palm. Within a week, the Count's hall filled with flickering candles, and Aldrich was summoned to sing verses that glorified Roderick's hunting conquests, while the fire crackled against the tapestries. The Count's steward, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, handed Aldrich a sealed parchment demanding he spread a rumor about a rival noble's alleged treason. Aldrich's fingertips brushed the cold vellum, and the ink felt like a thin layer of frost on his skin, urging him to speak words that were not his own. Each performance was followed by whispered instructions to insert subtle verses that praised the Count's generosity while casting shadows on any dissenting voice. The bard sensed the hall's stone walls press closer as the audience's applause turned into a measured hush, as if the very architecture were listening for betrayal. By the end of the night, he felt the melody in his throat tighten, a reminder that his art now rode on a precarious wire of political expectation. Ironically, the songs that elevated the Count's reputation also bound Aldrich to a rhythm of deception. Each lyric, a gentle lie, folded into a familiar refrain. He watched the Count's grin widen as courtiers whispered admiration, while the same verses slipped unnoticed into the ears of servants who carried the gossip to distant villages. The bard's own ballads, once simple tales of harvest and love, were now repurposed to mask urgent messages about secret meetings behind the scent of roasted pork. When a messenger arrived with a request for a new composition celebrating the Count's latest treaty, Aldrich smiled and began to draft a tune that would, in its closing line, hint at the treaty's hidden clause. The irony lay in the quiet way his harp strings vibrated with truth, yet the audience heard only the sparkle of flattery, unaware of the thread he was pulling tight. In the candlelight, Aldrich sensed the paradox of his craft. The more loudly he praised, the quieter his own voice became. One evening, after the hall had emptied and the torches sputtered low, Aldrich lingered in the empty corridor, the cool stone floor brushing his worn boots. He rested his lute against the wall, feeling the faint vibration of residual chords echo like a soft wind through an open window. The Count's voice, now a distant murmur, faded as the night settled, and the only sound was the distant clink of a water pail being carried down the stairs. In that stillness, Aldrich allowed himself to sip a mug of lukewarm ale, the bitter taste reminding him of the simple pleasures he once sang about. The weight of the contract loosened just enough for him to notice the humble tapestry depicting a harvest scene, its muted colors breathing a quiet reassurance. He closed his eyes, letting the calm of the stone hall wrap around him like a settled blanket. And for a moment, the pressure of patronage seemed as distant as a forgotten song. In the weeks that followed, Aldrich learned to weave his own truth between the Count's demands, letting the spaces between verses carry the sincerity he cherished. He observed that the patron's tyranny was not a sudden storm, but a slow drizzle that seeped into the cracks of every refrain he played. The bard's hands, now more steady, recalled the feel of fresh parchment, and recognized that even a compromised song could still echo a quiet honesty. He began to cherish the moments when a listener's eyes lingered on a single note, unaware of the political weight it bore, finding solace in those unspoken connections. The experience taught him that artistry, like history, often rests on the thin border between applause and silence, and that the most enduring verses are those whispered in the softest corners of a hall. With a gentle smile, Aldrich tucked his lute away, ready to greet the next sunrise with the knowledge that even a bard under a tyrannical patron can keep a fragment of his own melody alive. When the Count's anger turned to a cold stare, Aldrich slipped his lute into a battered satchel and followed the slow shuffle of a wandering troop. The caravan stretched like a sluggish river of cloth and canvas, its horses breathing in the early dusk. Dust rose from the packed earth, coating the strings of his instrument with a faint, gritty sheen. Travelers murmured about the road ahead, each voice a low hum against the creaking of wagons. Aldrich felt the first ache of distance settle into his shoulders, a quiet acknowledgement that the road would become his new audience. A few days later, the caravan entered a narrow valley where the trees narrowed like closed eyes, and the wind carried the distant clatter of steel. Bandits emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden by hoods, their hands rough on swords that whispered against the night. Aldrich's lute was shoved against his chest as he crouched beside a sack of cloth, listening to the muted thuds of boots and the occasional gasp of a frightened child. The clash was brief, the attackers retreating when the caravan's guard raised a torch that flickered like an angry firefly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the battle, and the road ahead seemed to stretch, unsteady under the weight of lingering fear. By the third sunrise, a fever crept through the camp, slick with sweat and the sour scent of boiled herbs. Aldrich watched his own hands tremble while attempting to tune a string that had swollen from humidity, each note sounding like a sigh from an old wooden door. A jester nearby chuckled softly as he tried to juggle dried figs that slipped from his fingers, turning the mishap into a quiet performance for the coughing men. The irony lay in how the very instruments meant to lift spirits now seemed to mock their fragility. Yet the troop persisted, sharing stale bread and a shared grin that barely concealed their weariness. The day ended with a chorus of rustling blankets, each breath a reminder that survival was as much a performance as any song. Night settled over the encampment like a warm shawl, the firelight painting gentle amber on tired faces. Aldrich rested his lute against a stone, feeling the coolness of the ground seep through his boots as he listened to the steady pop of embers. A cook ladled thin broth into wooden cups, the steam rising in thin ribbons that curled into the cool air. Around the fire, a minstrel whispered a melody so soft it seemed to blend with the cricket's rhythm, while a child traced patterns in the soot with a fingertip. The caravan moved no farther that evening. Instead, they shared stories of distant towns, each tale a slow thread stitching together the frayed edges of their collective journey. Weeks turned into months, and the miles accumulated like pages in a well-worn diary, each step imprinting a faint line upon Aldrich's back. The lute, now dulled by countless rains, still sang when his fingers found its familiar grooves, a reminder that the core of his craft endured beyond material, where he watched younger performers learn the art of patience, their eyes widening at the simple cadence of a road and the rhythm of shared meals. In quiet moments, Aldrich understood that the true toll was not the distance covered, but the subtle reshaping of his identity, forged by the steady pulse of the journey. When at last the caravan reached a bustling market, his song lingered in the air, a soft echo of the road's quiet lessons. The great hall of Castle Marlow glowed with low amber torchlight, the long table littered with polished pewter cups and half-eaten boar. Aldrich, a thin-bodied minstrel in a faded green coat-hardie, shuffled from a corner where his lute rested against a wooden crate. A herald's crisp voice cut through the murmur, calling his name to the king's feast, where nobles swirled their wine in heavy goblets. The scent of spiced stew mingled with the faint perfume of lavender from the tapestries, and Aldrich felt the weight of many eyes already turning toward him. He lifted his instrument, the wood warm from the hearth, and prepared for his final performance. He began with a slow, mournful tune that traced the river that ran past the kingdom's fields, each note drawing a quiet breath from the assembled guests. As the verses turned to the king's recent levies, the melody grew sharper, the words slipping like cold wind through the cracks of the vaulted ceiling. The courtiers shifted, their forked eyes flickering, while a low murmur rose from the corners like distant thunder. Aldrich's fingers trembled on the strings, yet his voice remained steady, describing how grain stores had emptied while the palace's golden plates grew fuller. The audience's initial curiosity hardened into a tense stillness that seemed to press against the stone walls. At the climax, a sudden clang of armor echoed, and two royal guards slipped from the shadows, their iron gauntlets catching the torchlight. They seized Aldrich's lute as if it were a weapon, pulling him from the bench, while the king's smile faded into a thin, painted mask. Ironically, the very note Aldrich had intended to linger, a soft, unresolved chord, hung in the air, caught between the clatter of boots and the rustle of silken sleeves. hall fell into a hushed pause, the only sound the crackle of the great fire and the faint drip of melted wax from a candle. In that measured silence, the danger felt as ordinary as the cold stone beneath the guest's boots. With the loot secured, Aldrich was led to a dim corridor where the stone floor was cool to the touch, the shadows deeper than the hall's bright glow. A lone torch sputtered along the wall, casting a wavering amber glow that made the dust motes appear like tiny, sleeping fireflies. The guards' steps were measured, their boots muffled by thick tapestries that absorbed the echo of every footfall. Outside, a night wind brushed against the castle stone, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant river water. For a moment, the frantic pulse of the feast receded, leaving only the slow rhythm of distant rain against the roof. Later, when the king's court whispered about the incident, the story of Aldrich's final note softened into a lesson about the thin line between song and silence. The bard's eyes, dim but steady, reflected the candlelight as he waited, his hands resting on a rough wooden bench that had known many travelers. History, in its endless catalogue, would note the incident as a quiet footnote rather than a grand rebellion, reminding future minstrels that truth can be wrapped in melody, yet still be clipped by power. Yet the lingering chord, never fully resolved, seemed to linger in the air of the great hall, a reminder that some notes survive beyond the moment they are played. In the slow turning of seasons, the kingdom moved on, while the faint echo of Aldrich's voice rested like a sigh in the stone. Aldrich arrived in the bustling market town of St. Malo with a worn lute slung across his back, its wood still warm from the road. The cobbles hissed under his boots as merchants shouted, and the scent of fresh baked bread mixed with the faint smoke of hearths. Children gathered around him, eyes bright, when he coaxed a simple melody that trembled like a candle flame. He tasted the modest gratitude of listeners, a fleeting warmth that made the weight of his instrument feel almost ceremonial. In those early mornings, the future of his trade seemed as clear as the sunrise over the river. Soon a local lord summoned Aldrich to a stone hall, where tapestries muffled the echo of his own footsteps. The great doors creaked, and the air grew cooler, tinged with the metallic scent of armor. He was ordered to compose praise for the Lord's latest raid, a request that felt like a thin blade pressed against his throat. The court's laughter rang like clanking shields, and a careless footstep knocked his lute, sending a string snap that thudded against the stone floor. The abrupt silence that followed reminded him how quickly favor could turn to peril. As the Lord's eyes narrowed, measuring his worth by the resonance of his strings, when Aldrich finally sang, his verses wove a tapestry of heroic deeds, Yet the audience cheered for hollow flattery, their claps sounding like distant rain on a tin roof. He watched the Lord's men nod mechanically, their faces blurred by torchlight, while a minstrel beside him whispered a sarcastic grin. The irony settled like dust on his hands, for each note that lifted the room also tightened the rope around his own tongue. He felt the paradox of being celebrated for echoing others' glory, while his personal stories fell mute, as if his own heart were a quiet lute left untouched in the corner. The performance ended with polite applause that barely rose above the murmur of a waiting fire. After the court emptied, Aldrich slipped into a dim tavern where the wooden tables were scarred by countless elbows. The hearth glowed amber, its heat brushing his chilled fingertips, and a mug of weak ale slid across the surface, leaving a faint ring of condensation. He set his lute against a wall, listening to the steady drip of rain against the shutters, each drop a soft metronome to his thoughts. The night stretched slowly, the clatter of distant carts muffled, and he allowed himself a brief respite, his eyes tracing the soot-stained beams above. In that ordinary quiet, the burdens of patronage seemed to dissolve into the steady rhythm of his own breathing. Morning found Aldrich escorted beyond the town walls, where an austere stone monastery rose like a sigh against the pale sky. The abbot handed him a simple quill, its feather light compared to the lute's heft, and a blank parchment that smelled faintly of dried herbs. He settled at a wooden desk, fingertips brushing the cool surface, and began to write about the very strings that had once bound him. The monastery's corridors carried a hush that felt both imprisoning and liberating, as the clamor of courtly applause was replaced by the whisper of ink spreading. In his solitude, Aldrich discovered that silence could be a companion rather than a sentence, and his new verses lingered like the last ember of a fire, warm yet fading gently into night. In the candle-lit great hall of King Aldrich, the young jester Finian slipped past tapestry-hung arches with a grin that caught the flicker of torchlight on polished stone. He balanced on a low wooden bench, his cap jingling softly as he tossed a polished apple into the air, catching it with a quick twist of his wrist. The courtiers watched his nimble steps, the rustle of silk, and the faint clink of goblets forming a quiet backdrop to his bright verses. Finian's tongue was quick, his words slicing through the murmurs like a practiced blade, earning a scattered chorus of chuckles. The scent of roasted venison drifted through the room, mingling with the faint pine from the hearth, grounding his performance in ordinary life. In that moment, the hall seemed to breathe with a gentle rhythm, and Finian felt the first stir of belonging among its stone walls. A few days later, the laughter faded as the steward whispered of a fragile peace threatened by neighboring lords, and Finian sensed a change in the air. The muted thud of heavy boots on the flagstones resonated louder than the lute strings, and the eyes of the king lingered on him with a weight that felt like cold iron. He was summoned to the inner gallery, where the soft rustle of parchment and the faint scent of ink marked a shift from entertainment to council. Finian's hands, still calloused from years of juggling, trembled slightly as he slipped a silk embroidered hat onto his head, a token of loyalty demanded in silence. The distant murmur of the kitchen ceased, replaced by a low, steady crackle of the fire, underscoring the seriousness that now threaded through his jokes. He realized that the court's mirth was a veil, thin as parchment, stretched over a tension that smelled of damp stone and unspoken fear. When Finian returned to the hall, his jokes took on a softer edge, each punchline a quiet echo of the court's hidden anxieties. He spoke of a rooster that crowed at midnight, its feathers ruffling in the darkness, and the audience laughed, unaware that the metaphor mirrored the king's sleepless vigilance. The soft rustle of velvet curtains swayed in sync with his pacing, while the clink of armor plates in the background reminded everyone of the looming threat beyond the castle walls. Finian's smile lingered just long enough to let the irony settle like ash after a fire, the audience's chuckles turning into a gentle, contemplative hum. The scent of wet earth from a recent rain seeped through the open courtyard, blending with the warm aroma of spiced bread, grounding the absurdity in tangible reality. In that delicate balance, laughter became a subtle shield, a thin layer of warmth against the chill of intrigue. Days softened into a measured routine. Finian found steadiness in the repetitive motions of his craft. He would glide across the stone floor each morning, the faint scrape of his leather shoes audible before the sunrise painted the stained glass windows with pale gold. The hall filled with the muted clatter of servants arranging silver trays, and Finian would pause to watch a candle flame flicker, its light touching his painted cheeks with a gentle warmth. Between rehearsals, he traded small jokes with the kitchen apprentice, sharing crumbs of stale bread that crumbled softly between their fingers. The occasional sigh of the wind through the narrow windows carried the scent of distant fields, reminding him of a world beyond the palace stones. In this steady cadence, the tension of earlier weeks settled like dust, and Finian settled into a quiet acceptance of his role within the kingdom's rhythm. When the last lantern dimmed and the hall fell into a hushed stillness, Finian lingered by the empty dais, feeling the cool stone beneath his feet. He traced the worn patterns of the tapestry with the tip of his finger, each thread a story of triumph and loss blended together, silent as the night outside. The faint echo of distant hooves faded, leaving only the soft rustle of his own breath and the lingering aroma of lavender from the Queen's chambers. In that moment, Finian understood that his mirth was both a mask and a mirror, reflecting the fragile humanity of those who wielded power. He allowed a quiet smile to form, not of triumph, but of gentle resignation, as he accepted the imperfect balance of laughter and duty. The night settled over the castle like a warm blanket, and the jester rested, his heart beating in time with the slow, enduring pulse of history. Finian entered the stone-walled hall of the ducal court with the soft shuffle of his mottled robe brushing the cold flagstones. His painted smile, already dulled by the waning light that slipped through the narrow lancet windows. The scent of damp wood and roasted pheasant lingered in the air, mingling with the low murmur of counselors hunched over vellum. He carried a slender wooden cane, its tip carved into a modest jester's cap, a token of his trade that felt oddly weighty in his hand. As he bowed to the lord of the manor, his fingertips brushed the embroidered cuff of a noble sleeve, feeling the faint tremor of nervous anticipation. The day began with the same ritual as any other: quiet jokes, careful glances, the unspoken bargain between mirth and survival. Soon the council gathered around the long oak table, the clatter of goblets punctuating the tense exchange of decrees and whispered accusations. Finian slipped his witty riddles between the speeches, his voice a low ripple that seemed to coax the stale air into a brief chuckle. Yet each jest carried a sharper edge that hinted at hidden misdeeds. He watched the lord of the eastern fief glance furtively at the treasury ledger, his eyes narrowing as a servant slipped a sealed pouch beneath the table. The jester's laughter, though soft, caught the rustle of silk as a steward tightened his grip on a scroll of overdue taxes, and the room fell into a brief, uneasy stillness. In that moment, the fragile balance between entertainment and exposure felt as thin as the candlewick burning low at the center of the hall. Later, a jealous lord named Alaric rose with a sudden swagger, his gaunt cheeks flushed red as he ordered a test that would make even the most seasoned performers wince. He commanded Finian to walk a narrow balcony 12 feet above the polished marble, balancing a single glass of clear water while reciting a verse about loyalty, all while the council watched with impassive faces. The balcony's stone rail was rough, the wind whispering through the open windows, and Finian's bare feet sensed each cold groove beneath his soles. As he lifted the glass, a draught knocked it sideways, sending droplets that clinked like tiny bells against the stone, a sound that seemed absurdly comic amid the dangerous chore. The irony was palpable. The jester, whose livelihood depended on laughter, now stood poised between life and a simple splash, his smile concealed behind a mask of calm resolve. When the glass tipped and water spilled onto the balcony, Finian steadied himself, his breath a slow rhythm that matched the soft drumming of distant rain against the castle walls. He continued the verse, his voice low enough to blend with the rustle of parchment, while the council's stern expressions softened into muted curiosity. The audience, accustomed to pomp, found an unexpected comfort in the jester's composure. The gentle sway of his cane echoing the sway of candle flames. The test concluded without injury, the water pooling into a reflective pool that mirrored the faint glow of torches, and the room filled with a quiet, collective exhale. In that shared silence, the tension dissolved like mist, leaving only the steady pulse of the hearth and the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. That evening, as the torchlight dwindled to amber, and the last counselors retired to their chambers, Finian sat alone on a wooden stool by the kitchen fire, the heat warming his shoulders, and the faint crackle of wood soothing his thoughts. He traced the soot-blackened edge of his cane, remembering the delicate balance he had walked, both literal and political, and sensed the subtle shift in the court's undercurrents. The flickering flame illuminated the faint scar on his cheek, a reminder that humor could be both shield and wound. In the soft hush, he understood that his role was less about exposing folly than about holding the fragile thread that tied the nobles together, a quiet testament to human imperfection. With a sigh that blended with the night's cool breath, he closed his eyes, letting the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat become the last story he told himself. In the stone-walled court of the Northern Duke, Finian shuffled between the low, flickering torches, his patched tunic rustling like dry leaves. The clatter of his wooden shoes on the cold flagstones blended with the murmurs of courtiers, who whispered that the jester knew more than his jokes would allow. A rusted brass kettle hissed in the kitchen, sending a thin wisp of steam through the open doorway, as Finian's eyes traced the pattern of soot on the walls. He lifted his cap, tipped it back, and surveyed the tapestry depicting a forgotten battle, its faded colors barely catching the amber light. The quiet of the hall settled like dust, while the rumor itself seemed to settle upon his shoulders like a second coat of wool. One damp evening, the spy master entered the jester's modest chamber, his cloak dripping with the chill of the courtyard rain. He spoke in low tones, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor echoing like distant thunder, offering Finian protection in exchange for secret ears and hidden eyes. The offer lay on the table beside a half-filled cup of warm broth, its surface trembling with each breath of steam. Finian felt the weight of the sealed envelope, its wax seal cool to the touch, as the spymaster outlined a web of whispered messages and concealed passages. The room seemed to contract, the shadows lengthening around the candlelight, while the jester's smile lingered, strained like a knot ready to loosen. Soon Finian found himself slipping notes beneath the banquet tables, the soft scrape of parchment blending with the clink of goblets and the low hum of lute strings. He whispered riddles that doubled as coded alerts, his laughter now a veil for the pulse of hidden surveillance. The irony lay in his bright motley, bright reds and golds, dulled by the gray of espionage. Each movement a careful tread on the thin line between mirth and menace. He watched the steward pour ale, the liquid catching the candle flame, and sensed how his own jokes now carried the weight of measured information. Yet the court continued its rituals, the fire in the hearth crackling with a steady rhythm that reminded him that even secrets are kept warm by routine. Days slipped into evenings, and the jester's routine settled into a quiet cadence. The same footsteps across the courtyard stones, the same gentle sigh of the wind through the open windows. He would sit on the stone bench outside the great hall, fingers feeling the roughness of the carved lion's mane, and watch the lanterns flicker as guards passed by, their armor clinking like distant bells. The spymaster's visits became as regular as the sunrise, each exchange a hushed murmur that faded into the background hum of daily life. Finian's jokes softened, his voice low, yet the audience still smiled, their laughter a soft cushion for the underlying tension. In that steady rhythm, the danger of his double game seemed to dissolve into the ordinary texture of courtly existence. When the first winter frost brushed the curtain walls, Finian lingered by the fire, his hands warm against the ember glow, reflecting on the strange not his life had become. He realized that identity, like the worn soles of his boots, bears the imprint of every path walked, whether in jest or in secret. The court's murmurs faded into a distant rustle, like pages turning in an old chronicle, while his own breath formed faint clouds in the chilly air. He understood that protection came not from titles, but from the quiet perseverance of ordinary moments, each sigh of the hearth a promise of continuity. With a soft smile, Finian bowed his head, feeling the gentle ache of being both performer and keeper of silent truths, and the night settled around him like a well-worn blanket. The great wooden hall glowed with amber candlelight as the winter feast stretched into the night. Finian, dressed in patched motley of muted reds, and weather-worn leather, moved between long tables where nobles lifted goblets of spiced ale. The clatter of silverware and low murmur of conversation settled like a slow river against the stone walls. Outside, the wind pressed cold through the mullioned windows, while inside the hearth breathed a steady, warm breath. Finian's fingers traced the embroidered cuffs of his coat, feeling the familiar weight of his jingling bells, a quiet reminder of his role as the kingdom's willing mirror. In the corner, a tapestry depicted a battle long past, its colors muted by time, unnoticed by the revelers. As the courses came and went, Finian sensed a shift in the rhythm of the court, a subtle tightening of the steward's grip on the goblet. He whispered a practiced rhyme into the ear of a young squire, hinting that the king had signed a hidden accord with the neighboring duke. The squire's eyes flickered, and a faint shiver ran across the polished oak, as if the hall itself inhaled a cooler draught. Around the long oak table, the lords exchanged glances that grew sharper than the blade of a sword, their faces drawn in muted concentration. Finian felt the weight of his own melody pressing against his throat, aware that each chuckle could carry the sting of accusation. The candle flames leaned forward, as if eager to witness what would follow. When Finian lifted his lute and began the satire, his voice rose in a lilting cadence that mimicked the king's own pompous proclamations. He wove a tale of a rabbit that traded its burrow for a silver key, a thinly veiled allegory of the monarch's secret treaty. The noble's laughter rippled, first soft, then sharp, like rain on stone, while the king's smile tightened into a thin line. A sudden clatter of armor echoed as a guard rose, and the hall's air grew heavy with the scent of spilled wine and fear. Finian's eyes, bright with practiced mischief, met the blurred face of a shadowed figure at the doorway, unseen but palpable. The irony settled like dust, the joke exposing truth, while the audience swayed between amusement and outrage. When the uproar subsided, the hall fell into an uneasy hush, broken only by the soft rustle of silk dresses and the low sigh of the hearth. Finian stood still, his bells silent, feeling the cool stone beneath his boots as he considered his next step. He glanced at the trembling hands of a young page, the only one whose eyes remained wide with innocence amidst the chaos. Choosing neither flight nor flamboyant sacrifice, he slipped a small loaf of stale bread into the page's satchel, a quiet offering of protection. The distant clang of a distant door closing marked the moment the king's guards began to retreat, leaving the room dimmer but steadier. The candlelight flickered gently, casting long shadows that seemed to pause, as if the hall itself was holding its breath. In the hours that followed, the feast's remnants lay scattered, cracked goblets, wilted rosemary, and a cracked tapestry that now displayed a new, unintended pattern. Finian, his motley dulled by the night's ash, walked the empty corridors, feeling the echo of each footstep against the cold flagstones. He recalled the subtle power of a humble jest, how a single verse could unsettle the foundations of power without a sword. The quiet of the stone walls reminded him that history often records grand battles, yet it is the soft, ordinary choices that linger longest. As the first pale light of dawn brushed the courtyard, Finian paused at a narrow window, the chill wind brushing his cheek, and allowed a small, weary smile to settle, grateful for the fleeting chance to protect the innocent. The world beyond the hall resumed its slow turn, indifferent, yet somehow gentler, as if the night itself had exhaled. In the stone-walled great hall, Finian shuffled between candlelight and polished armor, his motley of bright fabrics softened by the lingering heat of the hearth. The clink of goblets and low murmur of courtiers formed a steady backdrop to his light step, each footfall echoing faintly on the flagstones. He whispered jokes to the royal scribe, his voice barely rising above the rustle of parchment, while the king's portrait stared from its gilded frame, its eyes dimmed by age. The audience of servants and nobles watched his small gestures, the subtle tilt of his hat, as if waiting for a spark of merriment. Yet, beneath the painted smiles, Finian noted the quiet tension that crept along the borders of the room, like a draft finding its way through a closed window. One evening, as the rain tapped a steady rhythm on the leaded windows, a group of cloaked men slipped into the council chamber, their murmurs hidden beneath the crackle of the fire. Finian felt the temperature drop, a chill that brushed the back of his neck as the conspirators exchanged folded letters edged with ink. He observed the trembling of a lady's lace cuff, the way a steward's hand lingered on a cup, as if searching for a pretext to leave. With a soft chuckle, Finian began a tale of a fool who misplaced his hat, the story winding around the room like the incense smoke. The conspirators, caught between amusement and unease, shifted in their seats, the irony of a jester's humor framing their dark intent. When Finian's jokes reached their crescendo, he dropped a bright wooden bauble onto the marble floor, its clatter startling the conspirators into silence. He pretended the bauble was a warning, its shards reflecting the firelight like tiny mirrors of truth. And then he whispered a line about a crown that could be toppled by a single, careless jest. The court fell still, the only sound the soft sigh of the wind through the shutters and the faint rustle of Finian's cape. In that moment, the humor became a blade, thin and sharp, cutting through the veil of secrecy around the plot. The conspirators, realizing their scheme had been exposed by the very fool they had dismissed, exchanged glances that carried both fear and a strange, begrudging respect. The king, his beard dusted with ash, rose slowly, his expression a muted portrait of sorrow, as Finian slipped away toward the stone courtyard. The cool night air touched Finian's cheek as he lay down, his breath shallow, the distant hum of the bell tower marking the hour. Courtiers gathered around his still form, their hands trembling as they brushed away candle wax from his costume, the colors dulled by the soft glow of lanterns. A hushed lament rose from the lowly kitchen maid, her voice barely rising above the crackling fire, while the nobles bowed their heads, the weight of the moment settling like dust on the tapestries. In the silence that followed, the hall seemed to exhale, the echoes of laughter fading into a gentle, lingering quiet. Days turned into weeks, and the kingdom learned to carry Finian's empty seat as a reminder that humor can bear both shield and sword. The surviving jesters practiced his jokes with measured steps, their smiles tempered by the memory of his sacrifice, each punchline landing like a soft stone on a pond. Children in the courtyard mimicked his gestures, the faint scent of baked bread and wood smoke surrounding them, while the old tapestries whispered stories of a fool who gave his life for truth. The court's chroniclers recorded his tale in ink that ran slowly, the letters spaced as if to give the reader room to breathe. In the end, the quiet irony lingered. A man who made others laugh became the quiet echo that taught the kingdom the gravity hidden within a smile. In the soft light of a May morning in 1123, the young minstrel Aldrich gathered his battered lute, a wiry harp, and 2 apprentices beside the stone-paved market square of Liege, where the scent of fresh loaves mingled with river mist. The troop slipped through the low, timber-framed gates, their footsteps echoing on cobblestones that had felt the tread of merchants for centuries. Beyond the city walls, a ribbon of dirt road stretched westward, flanked by low hedgerows, and the occasional thatched cottage that seemed to sigh under the weight of spring rain. Their eyes followed the fleeting banners of passing peasants, each banner a promise of a village that might offer a patron's coin. The world felt wide, yet the pull of music and the hope of a warm hall made the distance feel like a gentle sigh. Soon the road narrowed around a bend where the limestone cliffs huddled like tired sentinels, and the wind pushed cold whispers through the gaps, rattling the harp strings. Aldrich sensed the change as the road crossed an unmarked feudal boundary, marked only by a faded wooden post stamped with a faded coat of arms, the lord's face blurred by the passing shadows, a distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and the low mutter of cattle gave way to the sudden rustle of reeds, and the sight of a ragged band of men emerging from the thicket, their eyes glinting with hunger. The troop halted, The harp's wood warm against Aldrich's cheek, as the men demanded a share of their meager provisions. The tension lingered like a thin fog, each breath a measured rhythm against the threat of steel. The bandits, however, turned out to be more than mere thieves. One of them, a wiry fellow with a cracked smile, confessed that he had once played a lute for a distant lord, who offered him a night's shelter for a single song. He spoke of the same lord's grand hall, where candles flickered over tapestries and the air smelled of spiced wine. Yet he now eyed the troop's modest satchel as if it were a relic of that lost hospitality. Aldrich, with a dry chuckle, offered a half-finished melody, and the men, caught between hunger and the faint echo of their own forgotten aspirations, lowered their weapons. The irony settled like dust on an old stone floor. The very danger that pursued them was born of the same yearning for the comfort that a patron might provide. By late afternoon, the troop found respite in a modest inn perched beside a slow-moving stream, its wooden beams darkened by the sun's amber haze. Inside, the hearth crackled, sending warm orange glimmers across the faces of weary travelers, whose eyes were half closed in the gentle lull of firelight. Aldrich rested his harp against a rough-hewn table, feeling the grain of the wood under his palm, while the apprentices shared stale cheese and warm broth that steamed softly. The innkeeper, a stoic woman with calloused hands, poured ale into earthen mugs, the foam spilling like quiet laughter. In the background, a night bird's faint trill blended with the low murmur of conversation, creating a tableau of calm that seemed to pause the world for a breath. As the night deepened and the troop prepared to set out again, Aldrich lingered by the empty doorway, listening to the distant river's steady hum against the stone walls. He reflected on the thin line that separates song from silence, noting how each step on the road carries the weight of unseen perils and unseen kindness alike. The harp, now cool to the touch, seemed to hold within its wood the memory of both the danger that had brushed their heels and the fleeting peace that had soothed them. In his mind, the melody of the day settled into a quiet refrain, a reminder that the world's vastness is stitched together by ordinary moments, each thread trembling with a gentle, inevitable humanity. In the pale blush of morning, the minstrels gathered at the edge of the village, their satchels heavy with lute strings and dried figs, their boots damp from the dampened lane. A low mist clung to the low trunks of Arden, letting the world feel muted, as if the forest itself held its breath. The troop moved in a single line, the lead fiddler tapping the rhythm of steps onto the soft earth, while the cook stirred a thin broth over a small brazier. Their voices fell into a hushed chant, a simple prayer for safe passage, the words dissolving into the rustle of leaves. The road ahead was a ribbon of gravel, winding between amber light and shadow, promising both audience and uncertainty. Midway through the canopy, a sudden crack of twig announced the presence of a band of ragged men, their faces half hidden beneath tattered cloaks. The clatter of steel against leather rang out as the minstrels froze, the fiddler's bow slipping from his fingers into the damp moss. Rough voices hissed demands for coin, the leader's hand trembling around a rusted axe that seemed more a symbol than a threat. The troop's drummer lowered his drum, the skin creaking softly, as if the instrument itself sensed the danger. In the tense pause, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the sound of a distant hawk that barely noticed the human drama below. Just as the tension seemed to tighten, a cough rose from the rear of the bandits, spreading like a thin gray mist that clung to the cold stone of a nearby ruin. The pestilence, invisible yet palpable, made the leader cough again, forcing him to retreat with a muttered apology, the rusted axe dropping onto the leaf-covered ground. In the same breath, a lord on horseback appeared from a hidden lane, his cloak embroidered with the sigil of a distant castle, eyes sharp as the polished helm he wore. He raised a hand, demanding a toll for the use of his road, the metal coins clinking coldly against his gauntlet, his greed turning a simple crossing into a bargaining game. The minstrels, already weary, exchanged glances, their faces softening into a resigned smile, aware that danger sometimes wore the mask of bureaucracy rather than swords. The road softened after the encounter, the forest opening into a gentle clearing where a small brook sang over smooth stones, its water cool against the travelers' bare feet. The minstries set down their packs, laying out a modest spread of bread, cheese, and the lingering broth, the steam curling up like quiet sighs. Their voices rose again, this time in a lullaby that blended with the murmuring water, each note a tender brush against the lingering chill of the morning. The lord, now distant, rode away with his retinue, his horse's hooves clicking on the hardened path, leaving only the faint echo of his departure. The bandits, having fled the sickness, disappeared into the trees, their presence reduced to a memory of rusted metal and half-spoken threats. As twilight brushed the horizon with a soft amber, the troop gathered around a dwindling fire, the flames licking the edges of their faces, casting shadows that danced like the stories they would tell. Their hands rested on worn instruments, the wood warm from use, their eyes reflecting a quiet understanding of the road's unforgiving nature. They recognized that danger lingered not only in swords or disease, but in the ordinary demands of lords and the fragile trust passed along dusty paths. Yet the music continued, a steady pulse that soothed the ache of travel, reminding them that each note carried a promise of tomorrow's audience. In the gentle hush that followed, the forest seemed to exhale, as if the world itself had settled into a patient, sleep-ready rhythm. The troop of minstrels stepped onto the cobbled road that led to the great west facade of Chartres, the stone arches catching the waning light like pale pages. Their satchels creaked with lutes, a drum muffled under a woolen shawl, and the scent of pine resin mingled with the chill of the evening air. They paused beneath a low wooden sign that announced the market, eyes tracing the silhouettes of clerics in long robes moving between the stalls. A soft murmur of voices rose from the square, the cadence of merchants bargaining, and children laughing in the distance. In that first moment, the city felt like a stage waiting for a quiet song. Soon a group of resident clerics gathered near the cathedral doors, their hoods shadowing faces that remained unseen in the dim, and a murmur of disapproval slipped through their muted chants. They regarded the itinerant instruments with a thinly veiled suspicion, whispering that such secular strings might echo heresy within holy walls. At the same time, the court musicians from the bishop's chapel, their strings already tuned for the next vespers, glared at the newcomers as rivals for patronage. A thin line of cold wind brushed the minstrels' cloaks, carrying the scent of incense that seemed to tighten the atmosphere. The troupe felt the weight of eyes that measured each note before it was played, and the stone pavement underfoot seemed to vibrate with an uneasy tension. Their leader, a wiry baritone with a scarred jaw, tightened his grip on the lyre, feeling the wood's familiar grain against his palm. A monk, whose face was forever blurred by the flicker of candlelight, stepped forward and offered a stale loaf as a token of peace. Yet his words sounded more like a legal decree than hospitality. The minstrels accepted the bread, its rough crust scraping against their fingertips, and began a modest refrain that drifted like dust through the cloistered arches. The clerics, hearing the melody, lowered their parchments and exchanged glances, as if pondering whether a simple tune could soften an unspoken accusation. Meanwhile, the court musicians, hearing the same strain, sighed and set down their polished viols, remembering the day they once shared a stage with a wandering poet before ambition divided them. The irony lay in how a single song could both soothe and sharpen the invisible divide between sacred duty and worldly desire. As twilight settled, the square dimmed into a soft amber glow, and the clatter of carts softened to a distant hum. The minstrels found a quiet corner beside a stone well, the water's surface reflecting the faint glow of lanterns, and they rested their instruments against cool bricks. A gentle breeze brushed the banners hanging above the market, rustling the fabric in a rhythm that matched their breathing. The clerics, after their evening prayers, passed by with measured steps, their hidden faces illuminated only by the faint halo of the setting sun. The court musicians, having completed their duties, lingered at a nearby tavern, sharing a mug of ale and letting the day's rivalry dissolve into muted laughter. In that shared stillness, the danger of earlier hours seemed to melt into the ordinary cadence of night. When the minstrels finally gathered their belongings to depart, the stone streets retained the faint echo of their final chord, a reminder that even fleeting notes linger in walls. The experience in Chartres illustrated how faith and profession could intertwine like tangled strings, each tugging at the other's tension without breaking. It also showed that danger often arrived not from swords, but from the quiet judgment of unseen faces, hidden in shadow and candle flame. Yet the travelers carried away a quiet lesson, that humility and a shared loaf could temper suspicion, and that music, though vulnerable, can bridge divides as subtly as a whispered prayer. History, observing from its tired perch, notes this episode with a soft smile, aware that human folly is as enduring as the stones beneath their feet. A thin caravan of minstrels wound its way along a forgotten crossroads, the hooves of their tired horses ticking softly against the packed earth, while the night curled around them like a damp blanket. The air held the faint scent of pine and distant hearth smoke, and the lanterns swung lazily, casting amber pools on worn leather straps and stitched tunics. Aldrich, the lead lute player, adjusted his battered cloak, feeling the weight of dozens of songbooks pressed against his chest. The road stretched ahead in a muted silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of a nightbird's wing. In this quiet, the troupe shared a modest repast of stale bread and cheese, their conversation a low hum of anticipation for the next village. Without warning, a ragged chorus of voices emerged from the shadows, the clatter of scythes and the low hiss of drawn swords stirring the night air. A coalition of bandits, their faces half hidden by hoods, converged with a lone noble whose armor bore the faint glint of a tarnished insignia, his anger palpable as he whispered of a stolen ledger. Aldrich's hand tightened around his lute as the first arrow whistled past, striking a wooden post and splintering it with a soft crack. The troop instinctively formed a thin circle, their boots digging into the cold soil, while the distant hoot of an owl seemed to mark the onset of a reluctant battle. Tension hung like mist, each breath visible, each heartbeat a muted drum against the looming danger. In the midst of the standoff, Aldrich raised his lute and began a slow, lilting melody that floated above the clatter. its notes slipping through the tense air like a weary sigh. The bandits paused, their eyes flickering between suspicion and curiosity, while the noble's grip on his sword softened as the tune recalled a forgotten childhood tune sung at his mother's bedside. As the minstrel sang of rain on stone rooftops, the combatants found themselves swaying imperceptibly. The absurdity of fighting to the rhythm of a lullaby becoming a quiet joke written on their faces. The irony lay in how a simple performance could momentarily suspend harsh intent, turning swords into metronomes and arrows into reluctant participants. The atmosphere settled into a strange calm, where the danger of the ambush was held at bay by the gentle persistence of song. When the final chord faded, the noble lowered his blade, and the bandits, their resolve waned, slipped away into the darkness, their footsteps muffled by the soft loam. The troop exhaled as one, the night air tasting of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of spilled blood from a wounded foot soldier. Aldrich brushed a stray strand of hair from his forehead, feeling the cool night breeze brush against his cheek, while his companions tended to bruised arms with simple cloth strips. The lanterns regained their steady glow, casting warm circles of light on the tired faces that now wore faint smiles of relief. In this pause, the road seemed less threatening, the silence deeper, and the distant stars, though hidden, whispered of a world that continued turning beyond their modest encampment. Later, as dawn's pale hues brushed the horizon, the minstrels gathered their instruments, each string still humming with the memory of the night's uneasy concert. Aldrich reflected on how the encounter had stitched their disparate lives together, the shared peril turning strangers into a cohesive thread of melody and survival. The road ahead remained uncertain, fraught with hidden dangers, yet the troop carried forward with a quiet confidence born of having turned threat into song. Their steps were measured, the rhythm of their march echoing the steady tempo of a heart that had learned to listen between the beats. In the soft light of morning, the story of the midnight ambush settled into the archives of their travels, a modest lesson in humility, unity, and the soothing power of a simple tune. At dawn, the troop slipped from the village square, their worn leather boots stirring dust along the river road. A lute rested against a fellow's shoulder, its wood warm from the night's fire, while a tambourine clinked softly with each step. The distant moor lay under a pale sky, its mist curling like an unrolled parchment over the fields. They sang low verses about harvest and hearth, voices blending with the rustle of wheat, carrying hopes of a patron in the next town. Yet even as the sun rose, the path ahead already whispered of the uncertainties that lingered beyond the horizon. Midday brought the first crack of danger when a ragged band of highwaymen emerged from a thicket, their swords catching the light like brief flashes of steel. The minstrels lowered their instruments, the gentle strings now taut with sudden tension, while a cough from a younger player hinted at a fever spreading through the troupe. The scent of damp earth mingled with the acrid smell of smoke from a nearby fire that the robbers had hastily abandoned. Under shouted commands, a few members hid beneath a low stone arch, the cold stone seeping into their skins, while others whispered verses to calm trembling hands. The encounter passed as quickly as it began, leaving only the echo of clattering boots and a lingering unease that settled like ash on the road. Later, as night fell, the group found themselves sheltering in a narrow chapel whose stained glass filtered moonlight into soft, blurred colors. The faces of saints hidden behind veils of shadow, an old monk, his robe frayed at the cuffs, offered stale bread that crumbled with the sound of distant thunder, a simple gesture that seemed absurdly generous after the day's strife. A stray cat slipped through the doorway, its whiskers brushing the lute strings, producing an accidental chord that drew a reluctant chuckle from the weary players. The irony lay in how a feline's indifferent prowl and a monk's quiet hospitality softened the harshness of bandit threats and illness. In that muted chorus of unexpected kindness, the travelers felt a fleeting peace, as if the world had paused to let them catch their breath. By morning they arrived at the stone walls of a distant abbey, its courtyard warm with the scent of rosemary and the low murmur of water from a nearby well. The minstrels set down their packs, feeling the cool stone beneath their palms, and unfolded a modest cloth on which they laid their instruments, the wood settling into familiar positions. Monks in simple habits handed them mugs of thin broth, the steam rising in gentle curls that brushed their faces, while candles flickered, casting a steady glow that steadied the rhythm of their hearts. They spent the day repairing strings, polishing drums, and recounting the night's perils in hushed tones that blended with the rustle of parchment and the distant chanting of prayers. The abbey became a sanctuary where the relentless dangers of the road softened into a quiet routine of rest and modest hospitality. As weeks turned into months, the minstrels wove the memory of their trials into new verses, their songs now carrying a faint undercurrent of resilience beside the usual lilting melodies. They observed how every scar on a weathered hand, every lingering cough, and each narrow escape informed the cadence of their storytelling, reminding listeners of humanity's fragile yet persistent thread. The abbey's archivist recorded their ballads alongside chronicles of harvests and raids, preserving the blend of art and adversity for future generations. In the gentle hush of the scriptorium, the troop recognized that danger had not silenced them, but had tuned their instruments sharper, allowing the tradition to survive through centuries. Thus, the echo of their once traveling footsteps remained, a soft, steady hum that still drifts across stone corridors whenever a minstrel plucks a string in remembrance. In the low light of early dawn, the cobblestones of Limoges glistened with a thin glaze of morning mist. Armand, a lanky youth of 17, lifted from his father's modest chest a battered lute, whose wood bore the fingerprints of countless hands, and a purse threaded with a few cracked copper coins. The market stalls beyond the town gate throbbed with the clamor of merchants arranging fresh wool, the scent of stale bread, and the occasional scrape of a horse's hooves. He felt the cool weight of the instrument against his palm, a reminder that melody must first be bought with bread. Yet the narrow alley echoed with his own quiet resolve, as he imagined verses that might someday rise above the clatter. Later that day, a silken carriage halted before the inn where Armand sought shelter, and from it stepped Lady Isabeau, her mantle dyed deep indigo and embroidered with faint gold threads. She surveyed the cramped room with a measured gaze, then asked the young troubadour to compose a ballad honoring her late husband, promising a modest stipend that would cover his rent for a season. Yet her contract listed a dowry of fine linen and embroidered sleeves, fabrics that rustled like distant coins when touched, and which the market price far exceeded the promised payment. Armand's fingers brushed the frayed edge of his purse, feeling the thinness of his means, while his heart tightened at the thought of trading song for cloth. The murmuring crowd outside seemed to hold its breath as the young man weighed ambition against the ache of hunger. The inn's fire crackled, throwing amber shadows across the worn tables, as Armand rehearsed the verses that would win Lady Isabeau's favor. Each strum of his lute sent a warm vibration through the wooden beams, yet the melody carried a faint strain of uncertainty, like a bird singing on a wire too thin to hold its weight. He recalled other troubadours who had sung for nobility without ever seeing the promised gold, their reputations swelling while their purses stayed empty. The irony lay in the town's belief that fame could substitute for food, that a name whispered in great halls could sustain a belly still empty at night. As the night deepened, the silence between notes felt heavier than any applause, reminding Armand that even celebrated art must first buy its own sustenance. Morning returned with a soft amber hue, and Armand walked the market square, his lute slung across his back, the leather strap pressing gently against his cheek. He paused at a stall where a baker offered a crust of stale rye, the coarse texture reminding him of the grain of his own unpolished verses. Passing a weaver, he watched ribbons of dyed wool unfurl like quiet rivers, their colors warm terracotta and muted ochre, matching the palette of his modest clothing. The townsfolk accepted his brief performances for a few copper coins, their smiles weary but honest, and the clink of change rested lightly against the strings of his lute. In the lull between songs, he felt a steady rhythm in his own breath, a calm acceptance that his art would continue to echo through the modest alleys of Limoges. As twilight settled, the town's lamps flickered, casting a gentle glow over the stone facades, and Armand returned to the inn where Lady Isabel awaited the finished composition. He delivered the parchment, its ink still slightly damp, and the lady traced the verses with a gloved finger, her eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction that did not demand immediate wealth. The agreed fabrics, though costly, were laid out beside a modest pouch of coins, a balanced exchange that felt less like a bargain and more like an acknowledgement of the mutual need between patron and poet. Sitting alone on the creaking floorboards, Armand let the lute rest against his chest, its wood warm from the day's sun, and mused that the harsh economics of his trade had taught him humility as much as melody. Within the soft hush of the night, he understood that every string he plucked was a thread weaving his existence into the fabric of the town, a gentle, imperfect tapestry that would endure long after the last note faded. Armand rode the winding cobbled road toward the stone walls of Count Raymond's manor, the afternoon sun casting a warm amber on the distant turrets. The air smelled of freshly cut hay and distant smoke from the kitchen hearths, while a lone pigeon fluttered over the outer courtyard. He carried his lute in a leather strap, its wood warm from the road's vibrations, and his mind held the quiet hope of a welcome song. Upon entering the great hall, the polished oak floor reflected the flickering torchlight, and a few courtiers turned their heads with polite curiosity. The Count's herald, a slender man in a muted green tunic, offered a modest bowl of spiced broth, its steam curling like a gentle sigh. Armand settled onto a worn bench, feeling the grain of the seat under his palm as he prepared his first verses. Soon the atmosphere shifted as the Count's steward presented a parchment stamped with the seal of patronage, outlining obligations that felt more like subtle taxes than gratitude. Armand learned that each fortnight a feast would be expected in his honor, the cost of fine wine and roasted game falling upon his modest purse. He was asked to present a hand-stitched banner embroidered with the Count's crest, the threads coarse, and the price sharp enough to sting his coin pouch. The steward's voice, low and steady, reminded him that a single missed note could invite a replacement. A fresh jongleur whose lute would be tuned at the court's expense. The hall echoed with clinking goblets and soft murmurs, while Armand's fingers brushed the edge of his own worn strings, feeling the tension of responsibility tighten. Outside, the wind rustled the reeds by the river, indifferent to the negotiations within. During his first performance, a rival jongleur slipped a damp cloth over the strings, muting Armand's melody and drawing a ripple of polite applause for the mishap. The Count raised an eyebrow, his expression blurred by the candlelight, while the court whispered about the failure with a detached curiosity. Armand's eyes lingered on a solitary merchant standing by the grain barrels, his ledger open and his silver coins glinting like rain on stone. The merchant offered a quick loan, grain for the next feast in exchange for a promise of future songs, the terms etched in the quiet of the tavern's shadowed corner. Armand accepted, feeling the grain sack's rough burlap against his shoulder, and the cool weight of the silver coins sliding into his hand. The irony lay in the simple exchange. His art, now bound to a staple of sustenance, his voice humbled by a pragmatic transaction. The following morning arrived with a soft mist that settled over the courtyard, muffling the clatter of distant carts and the low hum of servants preparing the day's meal. Armand sat beneath an ancient olive tree, its bark warm from the night's chill, and tuned his lute with deliberate, measured strokes. He watched the merchant unload the grain, the golden kernels spilling like quiet rain onto the wooden table, and felt a calm acceptance settle over his shoulders. The Count's steward arrived with a modest loaf of bread, offering it without ceremony, the crust crackling softly as it was broken. Armand's voice rose in a low, unhurried ballad that spoke of distant hills and simple labor, the notes blending with the rustle of leaves. In that quiet exchange, the pressures of patronage faded into the rhythm of everyday life. Night fell, and the courtyard lights dimmed to a gentle amber glow, the silhouettes of arches framing a scene of quiet endurance. Armand reflected on the invisible ledger of obligations that had weighed upon his strings, recognizing that the true currency of his art was not the silver he owed, but the moments of shared breath among listeners. He understood that the court's lavish expectations were merely a veneer over a universal human need: to be seen, heard, and modestly compensated. The grain merchant's sack, now empty, rested against the stone wall, a silent testament to the exchange of sustenance for song. Armand's fingers lingered on the lute's smooth wood, feeling its familiar warmth as a reminder of resilience. With a soft sigh, he closed his eyes, letting the night's cool air mingle with the lingering scent of rosemary. accepting the gentle cadence of his own story. Armand, a young troubadour with a weather-worn lute, sets out from his village along the pilgrim road that winds through low hills and misty hedgerows. The early morning dew clings to his boots as he watches farms stir awake, and the distant toll of a bell marks the rhythm of his steps. He carries only a sack of half-finished verses and a thin cloak, feeling the lightness of his possessions as a quiet promise of freedom. Yet every mile he passes is marked by the expectation that a song must be exchanged for the next morsel of hospitality. The road, calm and unhurried, already begins to measure his worth in measured lines and quiet chords. Soon the sun climbs high, and Armand reaches a roadside inn where the hearth crackles, spilling amber light onto rough wooden tables. The innkeeper, a stoic woman with calloused hands, listens to his opening stanza and replies with a thin slice of stale bread, a mug of lukewarm ale, and a firm reminder that a night's stay costs a fresh lyric. As the wind rattles the shutters, Armand feels the weight of each syllable pressed against his ribs, each note a small transaction that tightens the knot of his purse. The chatter of other travelers swells, a low hum that underscores the relentless barter of survival. In this modest chamber, the tension of hunger and art intertwine, and the road's promise becomes a ledger of need. A sudden gale drives the clouds low, ushering snow that muffles the world in a soft, gray blanket. Armand and a handful of wayfarers find refuge in the stone cloister of a remote monastery. The abbot, whose face remains a shadow behind the candlelight, offers a single loaf of coarse rye in exchange for a composition that will echo through the cloister's vaulted arches, while Armand strings together verses about the storm's cold breath. The monks listen with eyes half closed, their silence a gentle irony that the sacred space trades holy patience for simple sustenance. The loaf, warm against his cold fingers, is both nourishment and a reminder that even reverence is measured in material exchange. The humor lies in the quiet absurdity. A holy man, hidden in dimness, asks a wandering poet to give voice to the very silence that surrounds them. When the storm clears, the sun reappears as a muted orange, casting long shadows across the courtyard where Armand walks, his boot soles stirring dust that glitters like tiny amber flecks. He rests beneath a low arch, sipping thin broth from a wooden bowl, feeling the rhythm of his heart settle into the same steady pulse as the monks chanting in the distance. The day passes with a gentle ease. The barter of verses feels less like a contract and more like a quiet conversation between traveler and land. The climate softens, and the road, once a series of sharp exchanges, now rolls settles like a slow river, inviting him to simply exist within its flow. In this calm, the earlier tension eases into a measured contentment, as if the world itself has taken a breath and is waiting alongside him. As twilight deepens into a warm terracotta hue, Armand reaches the final village before his home. The road's stones cool beneath his feet, and the scent of hearth fires blends with the night air. He pauses by a low wall, watching children drift into sleep, their breath steady, while the distant hum of a lute drifts from a neighboring tavern, echoing the verses he has traded along the way. In the quiet that follows, he reflects on the ledger of his journey. Each song, each loaf, each night spent under stone arches now form a mosaic of modest triumphs and humble exchanges. The realization settles like soft ash. The harsh economics of his art were never about wealth, but about the steady rhythm of giving and receiving, a gentle barter that sustains both body and spirit. With a final low chord, he turns toward home, the road behind him a calm testimony to the endurance of quiet perseverance. The Festival of Fools spreads across the market square, banners of faded orange fluttering above wooden stalls. The air is thick with spiced meat, and the low murmur of townsfolk waiting for the day's entertainments. Armand, a young troubadour with a weathered lute, watches the gilded sign announcing the Golden Lyre, a prize that promises fame, but also a heavy entry fee of 3 bundles of wheat. He counts the weight of his own satchel, the grain already promised to the town's treasury for his recent apprenticeship tax. The decision feels like a careful step across a wooden beam, each footfall echoing with the possibility of debt or destiny. With a quiet nod to the master of ceremonies, he signs his name on the parchment and steps toward the makeshift stage. The crowd swells as Armand lifts his instrument, the polished wood catching the late afternoon sun. His voice, low and steady, drifts over the cobblestones, weaving a tale of distant battles, the rustle of armor, and the soft sigh of rain on stone roofs. As the refrain rises, a murmur ripples through the assembled peasants, their eyes sharpening like amber beads. When the final chord hangs in the air, a sudden shout erupts from the front row, demanding that the nobles who sponsor the festival share the riches they hoard. The clatter of wooden mugs and shuffled feet grows louder, the rhythm of the crowd matching the drum of their impatience. Armand lowers his lute, feeling the weight of an unexpected expectation settle upon his shoulders. The town's aldermen, cloaked in embroidered wool, step forward, their faces blurred by the shadow of their heavy hoods, and offer a reluctant compromise. The Golden Lyre may be claimed only if the winner promises to repay the treasury the sum of the entry fee, plus an additional portion sourced from noble coffers. The irony of the bargain is not lost on the onlookers, who see a troubadour forced to become a ledger keeper for wealth they have never touched. A few angry hands clench around the edges of the stage, and a thin line of firelight flickers as someone knocks over a lantern, sending sparks onto the thatched roofs. Yet the nobles, accustomed to quiet authority, remain seated, their silence a thin veil over a deeper unease. The riot smolders, the crowd's chant turning into a low, rhythmic chant that mirrors Armand's earlier melody, now repurposed as a collective demand. In that trembling pause, the festival's frivolity hangs in a balance like a candle flame against a draught. As twilight deepens, a slow hush descends, the clamor dimming to the soft rustle of fabric and the occasional creak of a wooden bench. A representative of the guild, his beard dusted with flour from the bakery, approaches Armand and suggests a temporary truce. The troubadour may keep the lyre for one night, while the nobles consider a modest contribution that would not bankrupt their estates. The nobles, hearing the practical tone, agree to set aside a portion of surplus grain, the exchange spoken in measured whispers that drift over the cool stone. Armand, his fingers still faintly tingling from the performance, accepts the arrangement, the lute resting against his chest like a warm stone. The crowd, now dispersed into small groups, watches the lanterns flicker one by one, each flame a small, steady eye. The night settles with a calm that feels as deliberate as a slow breath. The tension absorbed into the earth beneath their feet. In the quiet dawn that follows, Armand walks the empty streets, the golden lyre safely cradled in a velvet case, its polished surface reflecting the pale sky. He counts the remaining grains in his sack, aware that the debt will be repaid not through haste, but through a season of modest performances and careful stewardship. The memory of the festival lingers like the faint scent of rosemary lingering on the wind, reminding him that art can both illuminate and burden the soul. He pauses before the town's wooden gate, the sun warming the stone, and feels a gentle amusement at how a single song could stir the whole community. The episode becomes a quiet lesson etched into his mind, that the economics of a troubadour are less about coin than about the delicate balance of expectation, generosity, and the patient endurance of ordinary lives. With a soft smile, he steps forward, the cadence of his steps matching the slow, steady rhythm of the town waking to another day. In the late summer of 1173, the cobbled streets of St. Malo glistened under a tepid sun as Armand, a lanky troubadour, set his battered lute against the stone wall of the market hall. The murmur of merchants and the distant clatter of carts formed a low backdrop to his first verses, which rose like a thin mist over the stalls of dried figs and coarse wool. His worn boots left faint impressions on the dust, each step echoing the fatigue of many seasons on the road. Though his coat was patched with ochre thread, his eyes held a steady amber glow that matched the candlelight he would later carry. The townspeople listened with polite patience, their faces turned toward him like weathered shutters opened just enough to admit a breeze. But the day's heat gave way to a biting chill as the market emptied, and the town's granary reported a shortage. Armand's stomach rumbled, a hollow drum against the stone floor of his modest lodging. The tavern keeper, wiping a mug with a cloth as rough as burlap, offered only stale bread in exchange for a single verse, reminding Armand that art could not fill an empty bowl. The wind slipped through the cracked window, carrying the faint scent of rain that promised further hardship for the harvest. As the night deepened, the echo of his own lute strings seemed to mourn the silence of unpaid promises. The tension settled like a thin fog over his thoughts, each note now weighed with the prospect of hunger. Yet when the town council gathered under the faded banner of a long-forgotten saint, whose face remained hidden by the dim light of a single oil lamp, Armand presented a ballad that recounted the very scarcity they all endured. His verses, stripped of lofty romance, named the empty granary, the cracked hearth, and the quiet resignation of mothers kneading thin dough. The counselors, accustomed to grand proclamations, smiled at the stark honesty, their eyes flickering with a mix of amusement and weary respect. In an unexpected twist, they approved a modest stipend of 3 silver pennies a week, enough to buy a sack of beans, but not enough to buy pride. The irony lingered like the soft smoke of their incense, a reminder that truth could be more valuable than gold, though measured in the smallest of coins. With the stipend secured, Armand settled at a low table in the town's communal hall, the wood warm from the lingering fire, and began to compose his final ballad. The quill scratched gently across parchment, each line a steady ripple of ink that mirrored the crackle of embers nearby. Outside, a soft rain tapped the slate roof, a muted percussion that matched the cadence of his melody. He sang quietly to himself, the notes threading through the room like a thin, comforting shawl, while the townsfolk folded their hands over simple wooden cups, listening without expectation. The atmosphere settled into a lull, the weight of previous worries easing as the song stitched together moments of loss and quiet perseverance. When the final verse faded, the hall fell into a hush that lingered longer than any applause, and the townspeople carried the melody into their daily chores, humming it as they mended fences or tended vineyards. Years later, a weathered scroll bearing Armand's words hung in the council's archive, its edges browned like autumn leaves, reminding new generations that resilience can be recorded in a simple tune. Children would ask the baker to sing the ballad while the dough rose, their voices soft as sunrise, and the baker would smile, recalling the troubadour's modest stipend that had once steadied the town. The story of the 12th century troubadour thus became a quiet legend, a testament that even modest earnings, when laced with honesty, can echo through centuries. In the stillness of night, the wind through the cobbles seemed to carry the faint refrain, a lullaby of perseverance that history repeats with weary, amused patience. Aldrich the minstrel slipped through the stone arches of Valoria at dawn, his boots brushing the cool dust of the courtyard. The palace walls were draped with banners bearing the king's golden lion, and a fresh proclamation fluttered from the balcony, demanding every song praise the throne and the holy altar. Courtiers gathered around the marble fountain, their cloaks rustling like quiet paper, while Aldrich's lute rested against his side, its wood warm from the night's chill. He listened to the decree being read aloud, the words sounding like a tightrope stretched over a silent river. The air smelled of wax candles and wet stone, a reminder that even celebration was measured by authority. He felt the weight of expectation settle on his shoulders as the sun painted the tiles with a hesitant amber. That evening, while the kitchen fire crackled and servants carried platters of stew, Aldrich retreated to a dim alcove beneath the great hall's arches. There, by the flickering light, he whispered a new melody into his parchment, each line a soft echo of the peasants' cracked fields and empty granaries. His fingers brushed the rough fibers of the paper, feeling the contrast between the polished verses demanded by the court and the rough truth he was carving. The ballad grew quietly, its refrain a low hum that mimicked the sigh of wind through wilted wheat. He tucked the finished verses into the hollow of his lute, aware that the very act of creation now felt like a clandestine exchange. The night grew cooler, and the stone walls seemed to hold his secret with a patient hush. When the royal censor, a gaunt man with ink-stained sleeves, entered the hall the next morning, he moved through the crowd with the deliberate tread of someone accustomed to checking every corner. He paused by Aldrich's lute, his eyes scanning the polished wood before slipping a careful hand inside. The hidden verses fluttered up like a startled sparrow, their words exposing the hunger of field hands and the thin veil of the king's generosity. The censor's brow lifted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he realized the irony of a song meant to glorify the crown now sang of its shadows. He returned the lute to Aldrich with a soft clink, his voice low as he whispered that the court would hear all melodies, even those brushed in dusk. The court murmured, and the tension lingered like a thin mist over the marble floor. Later, a summons arrived, delivered on a leather scroll that rustled like dry leaves. Aldrich was escorted to the council chamber, the stone bench cool against his knees, and the vaulted ceiling humming with distant chants. The judges listened to his ballad, their faces unreadable, while the lute rested on the table, its strings humming faintly in the stillness. After a measured pause, they pronounced a mild penalty, a night of silence, a pledge to weave only sanctioned verses for a fortnight. Aldrich bowed his head, feeling the weight of the wooden chair against his back, and accepted the quiet decree without a raised voice. The room settled back into its routine, the candlelight flickering gently as if nothing had shifted. In the days that followed, Aldrich's songs slipped into the background of daily life, humming softly as servants swept the corridors and children chased each other by the hearth. He observed how the kingdom's rhythm persisted, each footstep a testament to endurance, each whispered prayer a faint echo of resilience. The censored verses lingered in his memory, not as rebellion, but as a reminder that truth can nestle beneath ceremony. When the fortnight ended, he returned to the court with a new composition that blended reverence and subtle honesty, its melody warm as the evening sun on stone. The audience listened, the court's atmosphere now tinged with a gentle curiosity, as if the world had turned a few degrees warmer. Aldrich felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that even in restraint, a minstrel's gift could linger like the afterglow of a fading fire. In the cool shade of the market square, Aldrich strummed a modest lute, letting a new ballad slip into the evening air. The melody curled around the stone stalls, coaxing the baker's daughter to hum as she lifted a sack of flour. By the well, the verses gathered like droplets, each line catching the last light of dusk. Passers-by paused, their hands brushing the worn cobbles, and the song spread as quietly as a murmur. No one noticed the thin parchment tucked beneath Aldrich's belt, its ink still wet with a hint of dissent. The next morning, Brother Hieron, the appointed censor, stood beside the town's stone notice board, his fingertips tracing the raised letters of the edicts. He read the ballad's opening line, and with a measured sigh, affixed a crimson seal demanding its silence. A clerk delivered a sealed parchment to Aldrich's modest cell, the Inquisition's wax still warm to the touch. The warning spoke of heretical resonance and promised swift correction, its tone as cold as the iron hinges of the prison door. Aldrich felt the weight of the paper settle on his shoulder, the rustle sounding like distant chains. That afternoon, Lyra, Aldrich's close friend, who sang the same verses in the kitchen garden, was led away by two gaunt watchmen. Her hands, still scented with rosemary and wheat, trembled as the wooden doors of the guild hall slammed shut behind her. The townsfolk watched in muted curiosity, the murmurs of the crowd echoing the very refrain the Inquisition sought to drown. The irony lay in the fact that the same melody now served as both a comfort and a condemned weapon, a soft hum that could summon both smiles and shackles. As the men disappeared into the narrow alley, the sun tilted lower, casting long shadows that seemed to carry the song away. Aldrich returned to the dimly lit tavern, the fire's amber glow flickering against the rough wooden beams. He watched the patrons sip their ale in slow, deliberate gulps, the clink of tankards a muffled percussion to his thoughts. The lute rested against his knee, strings slack, as his fingers traced the grain of the table, feeling the subtle grain of patience. He chose to keep his voice quiet, letting the melody linger only in the memory of stone and breath, a silent pact with the night's cool air. Outside, the wind brushed the shutters, carrying the faint scent of smoke and barley, a reminder that life continued unhurriedly despite the imposed hush. In the quiet hours before dawn, Aldrich sat by the open window, the sky a pale canvas, brushed with the first hints of sunrise. He reflected on the fragile thread that connected a song to the heart of a community, noticing how a single line could both bind and break. The whispering threat lingered like a soft rustle of leaves, yet it also revealed the resilience of those who, even without sound, kept the rhythm of their lives. He felt the cool stone of the wall against his back, steady and indifferent, while his mind wandered to Lyra's unseen face, blurred by the candlelight of her cell. With a calm sigh, he let the day begin, knowing that some truths survive in the spaces between words, quiet as a sleeping town. In the dim candlelight of his study, Aldrich traced the familiar melody of the old troubadour song onto a fresh vellum, his quill moving as slowly as a river's edge. The verses, once sung in bustling market squares, now bore a softened cadence, each word padded with the polite distance prescribed by the newly appointed censor. He listened to the faint crackle of the hearth, feeling the warm ash against his fingertips, as if the fire itself approved his caution. Outside, a thin drizzle tapped against the stone walls, a sound that seemed to echo the hush he tried to achieve in his lines. Yet even as he rewrote, a faint unease settled in his chest, a reminder that the act of softening could itself be a quiet rebellion. A messenger arrived that evening, his boots muffled on the cold corridor stones, bearing a sealed parchment stamped with the Chancellor's seal. Aldrich was escorted to the Hall of Judgment, a vaulted chamber where the scent of damp parchment mingled with the metallic tang of iron bars. The chancellor, his robes rustling like dry leaves, read Aldrich's verses aloud, his voice reverberating off the stone arches with a measured threat of execution. The audience, a handful of stone-faced clerks, watched the quill's ink dry as if waiting for a storm to pass. Aldrich felt the weight of history pressing upon his shoulders. Each heartbeat a muted drum echoing in the silent hall. Ironically, the very lines Aldrich had softened were deemed subversive, their gentleness interpreted as a veil for hidden dissent. In a moment of quiet desperation, he slipped the original manuscript into a hollowed oak beam, the wood cool and grainy under his trembling hand. The beam, concealed behind tapestries of muted earth tones, seemed to swallow the parchment whole, as if the building itself wanted to keep the secret. Yet a palace spy, his eyes sharp as a sparrow's, traced the faint scent of ink to the hidden niche, his footsteps soft on the stone floor. The spy lifted the beam with practiced ease, uncovering the fragile pages that trembled like leaves in a gentle wind. The discovery caused no sudden uproar. Instead, the corridor remained bathed in the amber glow of oil lamps, their light flickering lazily against the stone. The spy placed the manuscript on a low table, his fingers brushing the parchment lightly, feeling its texture as one would feel the grain of an old table. Aldrich, seated on a worn wooden stool, watched the scene unfold with a steady gaze, his breath steady as the night air that slipped through the narrow windows. The chancellor, having been summoned, arrived with a measured stride, his cloak brushing the cold flagstones, and simply nodded, allowing the moment to dissolve into quiet routine. The murmurs of other servants resumed, their conversations about hearth bread and whether filling the space, while the manuscript lay untouched, its fate lingering like a soft sigh. When the night deepened and the candles guttered low, Aldrich remained by the window, his hands clasped around a cool stone ledge, feeling the lingering chill of the day's events. The city beyond the walls whispered with distant bells, each toll a muted reminder of the passage of time and the transience of spoken word. In the stillness, he reflected on how the act of silencing had become a song of its own, resonating beneath the surface of daily chores. The memory of the hidden manuscript settled into his thoughts like dust on ancient shelves, a reminder that even softened verses carry the weight of intention. With a soft exhale, Aldrich turned away, letting the quiet night wrap around him like a familiar, unhurried blanket. In the late summer of the year 1324, the stone-cobbled lanes of Saint Marcel carried the faint scent of damp thatch and fresh ink. Aldrich, a modest troubadour with calloused fingers, spent evenings in the inn's back room, tracing his verses onto parchment by candlelight. His melodies wove together the rustle of wheat fields and the low murmur of the river, and the townsfolk whispered that his songs could coax a smile from even the most stoic mason. Yet a new edict had arrived from the palace, demanding that any verses that questioned the crown's authority be surrendered. The decree lingered over the market stalls like a thin veil, and Aldrich felt the first tremor of unease as the night's quiet slipped into a tentative hush. Weeks later, the great hall of the king's court filled with the dry crackle of torches, their orange tongues licking the vaulted stone. Aldrich was led, bound at the wrist, to stand on a raised dais, while the inquisitor, cloaked in muted gray, unfolded the forbidden manuscript with deliberate slowness. With a voice that resonated like a low drum, the inquisitor recited the opening stanza, each word echoing off the cold marble, the syllables hanging heavy in the smoky air. The courtiers shifted in their leather seats, the faint rustle of embroidered sleeves punctuating the silence between lines. As the verses detailed the king's failures in metaphor, a faint tremor rippled through the assembled nobles, the sound of a distant wind brushing the narrow windows. Aldrich's eyes, dim with resignation, traced the flickering shadows that danced across the vaulted ceiling, as if seeking a place where his own voice might still be heard. When the final couplet was spoken, the king's hand rose, a glint of iron catching the torchlight, and a thin smile curved his lips. He pronounced the songs corrupt, ordering the parchment to be torn, and the verses to be cast into the great pyre that smoldered beyond the courtyard walls. The executioner hefted a heavy iron rod, its surface warm from the nearby fire, and the guards moved with a measured, almost rehearsed gait. Yet Aldrich, his throat tight but steady, lifted his chin and began to sing the last stanza, his voice a low, unwavering thread that wove through the rising heat. The melody rose above the crackling of the wood, a defiant refrain that seemed to coat the flames with a thin amber veil. In that moment, the irony lay in the soft persistence of his song against the harsh decree, a quiet rebellion that the stone walls could not swallow. The fire grew, its orange glow spilling onto the stone floor, warming the night air while casting long, wavering shadows of the assembled crowd. Aldrich's song faded gradually, each note lingering like a breath held in the stillness of the hall, until the final word dissolved into a sigh of embers. The executioner's blade slipped silently across the rope, and the knot released with a muted snap, the sound swallowed by the steady roar of the blaze. Spectators remained motionless, the only movement the soft fall of ash onto their cloaks, the scent of burnt parchment mixing with the lingering smell of hearth wood. As the flames licked higher, a calm settled over the room, as if the fire itself were a slow metronome marking the passage of an unhurried day. When the fire finally waned to glowing coals, the torches were dimmed, and the courtyard fell into a hushed twilight. The stone walls absorbing the heat like a weary animal settling after a long walk. Aldrich's empty stool remained at the edge of the dais, its rough wood now warm from the lingering ember heat, a small reminder of the voice that had once filled it. The king's courtiers dispersed quietly, their footsteps echoing faintly on the cobblestones, each carrying a piece of the evening's quiet lesson about the weight of words. In the weeks that followed, the townspeople whispered the melody in low tones, the tune drifting through alleys like a ghost of smoke, preserving the song in memory rather than on parchment. The story settled into the collective past, a calm, slightly rueful reminder that even the softest voice can leave a trace when the world grows still. In the stone-walled scriptorium, the accidental spark leapt from a guttering lantern to the thatched roof, setting the illuminated vellum ablaze. The orange flames licked the wooden beams, devouring the carefully copied verses that had once whispered dissent. As smoke curled through the narrow windows, Lyra, a young apprentice freed from her oath by the chaos, slipped past the fleeing scribes. Her hands, still stained with ink, clutched the half-burned edge of a parchment that had survived the heat by sheer chance. Outside, the cold night air brushed against her cheeks, carrying the faint echo of a melody that seemed to rise from the crackling fire. The kingdom's censors, startled by the loss of the manuscript, ordered the hall to be sealed, unaware that the tune had already slipped into the streets. By the next dawn, a handful of villagers gathered in the cellar of a baker's house, the low ceiling muffling the world above. In the dim lantern light, they hummed the fragment that Lyra had rescued, each breath trembling against the stone walls. The scent of fresh bread mingled with the lingering smell of ash, as fingertips brushed the rough wooden table where the tune was whispered. Yet the royal guards patrolled the main streets, their boots echoing loudly, reminding everyone that the kingdom still watched for any dissonant chord. The singers lowered their voices, letting the melody linger like a secret, while a shadowed figure, face blurred by the flickering light, gave a silent nod of encouragement. The tension sharpened, for each night the gathering risked being discovered. But the music persisted like a candle, refusing to be snuffed. Ironically, the very act of silencing the written word forced the people to carry the song on their lips, turning a forbidden script into a communal chant. As the refrain spread from cottage to market stall, traders began humming it while weighing barley, and the pattern of resistance softened the kingdom's stern edicts. Aldrich, the former court minstrel, who had been condemned for daring verses, was remembered in hushed tavern stories as a martyr whose blood had seeded the tune. The irony deepened when the crown, seeking to restore order, commissioned a modest minstrel to record the popular melody, inadvertently legitimizing the very protest it feared. In the evenings, the royal archivist, his face hidden behind a high-collared cloak, watched the villagers' simple gatherings from a distance, noting the quiet shift in loyalty. The punishment that had intended to erase dissent instead amplified it, wrapping the kingdom in a soft, unassuming chorus that no law could fully quiet. Over the following seasons, the melody settled into the rhythm of daily life, accompanying the turning of grinding stones and the rustle of wheat fields. Lyra, now traveling between hamlets, sang the tune beside hearths, where children traced patterns on the soot-blackened floor with their fingertips. The warm amber glow of oil lamps bathed the simple rooms, and the song's cadence blended with the sigh of the wind through thatched roofs. In each village, the tune was taught gently, as if passing a treasured stitch from one hand to another, its notes lingering like the scent of rain on dry earth. The kingdom's officials, observing the calm persistence of the music, relaxed the harshest bands, allowing modest verses to be copied under careful watch. A quiet equilibrium emerged, where the once dangerous song became a comforting background to ordinary chores, a reminder that rebellion need not always roar. Looking back, historians note how the ember of a single manuscript ignited a persistent hum that outlived the flames that consumed it. The legacy of Aldrich, face forever blurred in the annals, serves as a subtle warning that truth can be both fragile and resilient, depending on how it is carried. Lyra's itinerant steps turned into a gentle ripple across the kingdom, illustrating that even the smallest voice can soften stone walls when repeated patiently. The softened censorship reflects a slow recognition that silencing a melody only redirects its flow, much like a river finding a new channel through a cracked dam. In the quiet evenings now, when the night air carries the faint strains of the old song, listeners feel a quiet gratitude for the price paid, without overt lament. The story settles like a well-worn blanket, offering a still, slightly melancholic comfort to those who remember that history often sings in the spaces between deeds.